Okay, welcome everyone. I'll get started. So thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really great to have you with us for this ESRC Festival of Social Science event, Decarbonising Transport, how do we work together to make an impact? I'm Louise Reardon, I'm a Senior Lecturer in Governance and Public Policy at the University of Birmingham. Before I introduce our panel, just a brief word on why we're here tonight. So the transport sector accounts for 27% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's the largest emitting sector in the country. The Committee on Climate Change, so the independent advisor to the government, estimates that we need to reduce emissions from transport by 67% between now and 2035 if we're going to be on target to meet our climate change commitments and obligations. But the transport sector is proving a tough nut to crack. So since 1990, we've only managed to reduce our emissions by 3%. So we've got a lot to do to make the change we need to make. But what do we do and how do we make a difference? That's what we're here to discuss this evening. And importantly, we're doing so recognising the importance of communities and local level action in doing so, which is often overlooked, and at least in the national discourse. So to our panellists, really privileged to have a really inspiring group of speakers tonight. So first up, Karen Craven. Karen's Chief Executive at the Active Wellbeing Society. This is a community benefit society and cooperative based in Birmingham, which is working to tackle inequality and promote community well-being. Karen's an innovative public sector leader with a reputation for disrupting, provoking and inspiring change, pushing at the boundaries of provision and always fighting for the least heard voices. She's overseen the delivery of multi-million-pound projects, operated at a senior level within Europe's largest local authority, and influenced significant systems change across health, transport, sport and physical activity. Karen understands how to shift systems and facilitate transformative change across sectors, knows how to speak truth to power and how to lean in, be with and fully engage with underrepresented communities at scale. So we're delighted to have you with us tonight, Karen. Next is Chris Todd. Chris is Director of the Transport Action Network. Chris has been a campaigner for over 25 years. He first became active with his local Friends of the Earth group while working at a recycling cooperative and studying for a postgraduate diploma in environmental impact assessment. Chris's main passion for campaigning has been around planning and transport. And in the 1990s, he helped coordinate an alliance of groups along the South Coast, SCAR, South Coast Against Road Building, opposing the proposed Folkestone to Honiton Trunk Road. Since then, he's held a number of local positions representing the community and voluntary sector. He chaired the partnership bidding for the local area around Brighton to become a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, which was successfully achieved in 2014, the first in the UK for over 40 years. From 2014 to 19, he was employed by the Campaign for Better Transport to support local groups fighting road building and bus cuts. And Chris set up the Transport Action Network in 2019. And last but by no means least, Tamir Nokta at the University of Birmingham is a lecturer at the Institute of Local Government Studies and co-lead of the CREDS project, facilitating policy change towards low carbon mobility, which inspired this event tonight. Tamir is an urban studies scholar with an interdisciplinary background rooted in public policy, management and architecture. Her research focuses on networks and governance in urban policy and implementation in the context of technological change, especially in relation to decarbonisation and digitalisation. Prior to joining InLaGov, Tamir was Senior Research Associate at the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction at the University of Cambridge. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So to what we're going to do and what the format's going to be. So we appreciate it's a bit different when we're doing things online, and we want to try and make it as participatory as possible. So we've got 3 themes that we'd like to discuss tonight. We're going to take about 10 minutes for each one. At the start of each theme, we're going to put to you an oversimplified poll question, not scientific, just to sort of get a sense of the feeling in the room and act as a provocation for our panel. So the first thing we've got is around whether we actually have the power to affect change towards a sustainable transport system. And I'm going to just launch our first poll. So the question is, how confident do you feel that we can create a sustainable transport system? So those of you at home, please answer this poll question. Do you feel very confident? Confident, but we need to act now. Not confident, we're going pretty slow, or we're doomed. I'll leave that for a couple more seconds. Okay, so coming out, 4% said very confident, 42% said confident, but we need to act now. 50% of the audience are saying not confident, things are going pretty slowly, and 4% have said we're doomed. So a bit of a mixed bag, but maybe by the end of this, we'll be able to turn things around. So thank you for answering that question. So to our panel then, around this question of, do we have the power to affect change? With such a big issue and pretty slow progress being made, as the audience suggests, it can be hard to know where to start. So a question to all of you, but I'll start with Karen first. How do you see the ordinary person on the street being able to make a difference to this? How can we affect change on this agenda?
Lovely, thanks very much. I'm tempted to say I think it's only the ordinary person on the street that is going to make any changes. Actually, I'm not convinced that change happens where the policy gets written, but I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I think that often it's the accumulation of all the small things that we do, where we practice our own agency, where we badger, where we cajole, where we step in alongside people who are like-minded. I had a quick look at who's here, and without wanting to do any shout outs, there's a woman in your audience, Anne Gallagher, who to me completely typifies exactly the kind of person that's out there making a difference, and that will you know, if we had more like Anne, that would be exactly what we would need to really make a difference in this city and internationally. And there's a saying, isn't there? It's a small group of people that come together to make things different, and that's all that ever does change anything. There's loads that we can do on an individual level, and there's loads that we can do to practice the techniques, I guess, of putting our money where our mouth is. Or there are also real barriers there, and I don't want to minimize those. You know, there are real barriers that the system needs to overcome, but all of us, I think, can do the bits that we're able to do. I'm thinking particularly about some of the work that we do. You know, people experience multiple barriers to being able to make a difference. Sometimes it's cost that's the barrier. You know, they can't afford to perhaps get a bike, and you know, there are things that you can do about that as policymakers and as the system. But ultimately, I think it's only ever small groups of people that make a difference. On a really, really practical level, it's about, I guess, leaning into what you can do, not taking for granted that the system does need to shift. And I'm kind of a bit torn, I suppose, because I'm also aware that there are some massive things that need to be done by the people who've got the power. But we all have a say, we all have agency, and we to lesser and greater degrees, we've all got a bit of money. So where we put that money, how we practice putting our values into action, and who we badger, I think are probably some of the most practical, important things that we can be doing. The ordinary person, I'm not sure, I even hold with the premise, I'm not sure what an ordinary person is, but as individuals, there are always things that we could be doing that will make a difference. And if we join together to do them, it makes a big difference. I'm going to leave it there for now, but I'm going to have plenty to say, I'm sure.
Thanks, Karen. And I forgot to say, because I always forget something, please, everyone at home, do post your comments in the chat. If you've got a question, do put it in the Q&A box. It's easier for me to track the questions, but please do ask any questions as we go along, and I'll try and field those as we go. Chris, what are your thoughts on this question I posed?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I was with the audience sort of torn between confident and having no confidence at all. I mean, I think Karen's right. There's a lot of things that individuals can do, but I think it's a question of actually individuals knowing what they can do and understanding the problems to be able to tackle that. And I think there's a big issue there in terms of understanding, and also in terms of relevance to people who don't necessarily see what climate change has got to do with them, or how it's going to impact them, or it's, you know, they're too busy earning a living or looking after a family to think about it. So there's a whole information and engagement process that needs to happen with individuals if individuals are truly going to make the changes that we want. You know, I think we here in the audience are probably a bit more switched on to some of the issues and probably in a better position to try and advocate that change, but I think there's a lot of other people who aren't. I mean, I actually live in Brighton, and some of you might have seen the headlines recently about our Green leader who flew to Glasgow. Now, I've not seen the local politicians so animated about climate change, but not about doing the right things around climate change, but creating a political fuss about issues and trying to point score. And I think that's a real barrier at the moment to actually achieving change, because as Karen said, there's people in power who need to make decisions and do things. And it's all right somebody saying, oh, I've got a bike in the shed, I'll get it out and try it and start using that a bit more than a car. But if you don't feel safe on the roads, then that's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen for very long. And we need, you know, the politicians to be able to create the right environment for people to be making the right choices and to maximize that, because we've got to move this pretty quick. So we can't rely on just one or the other. We've got to have all of it happening. And at the moment, I don't see the political leadership at a national and at a local level being there. There are a few exceptions, I think, if you look around some of the city regions, but even there's contradictions in what they're doing, whether it's, you know, Sadiq Khan and the Mayor of London and Andy Burnham in Manchester. There's still big road building plans happening in there. So, you know, we've got to try and pressurize at all levels and embolden at all levels. But I think at the moment, politicians don't really see this as an emergency, and that's part of the problem. They're still point scoring over one another, trying to get a bit of an advantage for the next election, and not realizing actually this is bigger than COVID. And if we don't tackle it, it's going to have far bigger implications than COVID. So, you know, we need to be coming together on this to find common cause and to work it through.
Thanks, Chris. Tamir?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you make, that Chris was saying around the difference between the rhetoric and then what happens in practice. And I think maybe one of the things that is coming out of our research projects as well is that we have seen this influence that different protest movements had on recognizing that climate change is an issue. I guess most recently around declaring climate emergencies in response to XStar and some other protests at the time, and then signing up to these net zero commitments. But then these institutions were, especially local authorities, also very quick in setting up all sorts of task forces and working groups and advisory boards, and perhaps getting something down onto paper. But that was also, it kind of felt like that was also where things stopped as well. So I guess a key question then is how to keep that momentum, and also how to deliver on those commitments that are put on paper. And of course, this has something to do with holding institutions accountable to those commitments that span over political election cycles, which I think is very much related to what Chris was talking about as well. But I'm wondering whether perhaps that is also a point in which communities and community organizations who are here to stay and aren't going away with election cycles can potentially make an impact in trying to hold those institutions that have the power accountable to the commitments that they make. And I guess if I can, I would answer with a question as well to Karen and Chris, whether from their perspective, is that something that is at all possible, and potentially not only on the local level, but also perhaps further higher up in the hierarchy?
To hold institutions to account. Yeah.
Yes.
I was, as you were saying it to me, I just thought that's absolutely spot on. But it speaks to something for me that Chris said, which is that which is having the awareness and knowledge sometimes to know about what you can do and about how you can hold institutions to account. I think for organisations like mine, I think one of the really important roles that we can play is to join the system to more of itself. And what I mean by that sometimes is to be that bridge between the institutions that are making the power. You know, we don't have a lot of power as an organisation. We have some, but we don't have loads. And then the communities that and you know, to kind of help bridge their needs and their requests and their aspirations, but also the barriers for them. You know, what's stopping them from doing the things that climate action needs us to do, for example. So being the bridge between their lived experience and the reality of what the policymakers or the decision makers think that they're making their decisions based on. I think sometimes there's this real kind of misfiring in the process because the system isn't joined up to itself enough. I think that is one of the ways that we can hold the system to account to make sure it hears more of the unheard voices. But I absolutely think it's something we should, organisations like mine should very much be aspiring to do, you know, to kind of understand the debate and be able to translate that then into practice on the ground, because you know we are seeing daily the kinds of things that are getting in the way of people being able to make the kinds of changes that the climate's going to need us to change, and also the risk for them of being left behind in it. Because if we don't get this right, there are whole swathes in our communities that will get left behind and even further disadvantaged by the changes that are going to need to be made.
Thanks, Karen. I wanted to pick up on a related point that Chris made about people understanding or being informed about the changes they need to make. And there's a big sort of debate at the minute around actually the focus being on sort of the infrastructure and the supply. So there's a lot about electric vehicles, for example, but not very much about actually the need to maybe reduce the amount we travel or trying to encourage walking and cycling, and or sort of even, you know, even this suggestion that we might fly less was really, you know, stamped down on and refuted by central government. So I mean, do you see the role of your organisation or, you know, other kind of local action groups to sort of really try and put that message out there as well? But yes, politics has to do different, and people need to be supported, but also actually just helping to sort of unpack the scale of the challenge and, quite honestly, some of the sacrifice we might need to make towards this agenda.
Was that aimed at me?
Chris, yeah, sorry, I was aiming it. I mean, anyone can answer. I was just reflecting on your point.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where education is really important. I don't mean that in a patronising way, but I think a lot of people don't realise that actually it's a very small percentage of the population who are actually having a huge carbon footprint. You know, the number of people who fly is actually, or use most of the flights, is actually very small, and a huge number in the population, I think it's about 50%, don't fly at all. So, you know, when we're talking about cutting back and restricting, actually, it's for the vast majority, it probably isn't huge change. It's the very rich that it's going to impact. And unfortunately, at the national level, the very rich seem to be very tied into the government and policy. And I think affecting that national policy change is much harder. I mean, we're now on our third legal challenge, trying to push the Department for Transport into doing something sensible around road building and reviewing, you know, the impact of roads with climate change, which it's still refusing to do. But I think on a local level, there is more opportunity for local communities to affect change with those local institutions and local politics, because there's more of a relationship, there's more of an immediate effect, if you like. Those individuals potentially have more of a say because they have a vote which is directly related. With a government minister, no one has a vote that's directly related to them, apart from their own constituents. So it is harder to influence, and they are more remote. So I don't know what the solution is. It does require, I suppose, a coming together of civil society at those different levels. And marshalling that can be quite difficult as well, because every organization will have its own priorities, its own ego, its own need for its own publicity. So trying to get people together and to work in sort of networks and coalitions is much harder, but the benefits of it, if you can do it successfully, are very, very great. You know, and I've seen that in the campaigning work I've done. And one of the things that I was involved with was the campaign for the South Downs National Park, and we had 160 organisations coming together. Where, you know, it's quite a task getting those groups together and on the same agenda. But if you can do it, then the rewards can be really great. And I think we're going to have to start thinking about things like that to make it more feasible that we can achieve this change, because at the moment it doesn't seem like we're on the right path.
We've had a couple of comments and reflections in the chat, which I think speak to our second sort of theme that we're wanting to explore. So the second one is, who should we be working with, and working with in the broadest sense? So Patrick in the chat puts Birmingham City Council has committed to net zero by 2030, but it has no chance of reaching it unless central government fully backs it. And Anne makes the point that public transport's just simply not good enough. It needs to be fast, frequent, funded, staffed, clean. Low paid people often have to pay for taxis to get to work at 5 a.m. for a 4-hour shift. So these kinds of comments, keep them coming in the chat and lead to this second point. So our next poll then, so we set up this whole event as sort of saying, you know, how do we work together to make an impact? So our underlying assumption is that collaboration is a good thing and we can't do this alone. But we also know, as alluded to, that, you know, some people and organisations are more powerful than others, and can be real enablers or gatekeepers to change. So again, our second very unscientific poll is around who we think is the most influential. So who do you at home think has the most influence over your local transport system? Is it your local authority, local business, politicians, transport providers, the DFT, other? Put them in the chat and we'll have a conversation about those. Okay, I've got a few more votes trickling in. Coming out at the top with 43% is the local authority. No one said local businesses. 25% saying politicians, 8% saying transport providers, 21% saying Department for Transport, and 4% saying other. And in the chat, we've got recognition of regional agencies, so West Midlands Combined Authority, for example. Okay, so with that said, Chris, I'm going to come to you next. So in your experience and with your campaigning work, who are the most important people we need to be working with or influencing, and why?
I'm going to take the easy answer and say everyone. I don't think you can leave people out, and I'm in some respects, I suppose I'm slightly surprised that no one said businesses, because they can influence politicians quite substantially sometimes, and it's really giving politicians more confidence. I think that's what we've got to do, the more confidence to do the right thing, because as we've seen with a lot of the stuff that happened, the temporary measures that happened over the summer, whether it was cycle lanes or low traffic neighbourhoods, it didn't take much noise on sort of Facebook pages to get some councils to sort of run a mile and abandon everything. You know, something that was recognised by central government, that actually those aren't necessarily very representative. They're very noisy, very loud, potentially very well organised, but they can be quite a small proportion the actual population, and it's the silent majority who do want these changes, who get overshadowed in some of these arguments, and the politicians get frightened that it's they're not going to get re-elected, basically. So I think the more that we can give confidence, and that's why people like businesses are also important, to make sure that they're pushing in the same direction and not also trying to pull the politicians somewhere else. But as much as, so you need to have that local structure and that local support for the local authorities to be doing the right thing with the funding that they've got. But actually, to achieve what we need, we also need the DFT to be properly funding those measures as well, because the more ambitious local authorities will tell you they're sort of hamstrung by the fact that they haven't got enough funding to deliver what they want to do fast enough. So that's why I say it actually is at all levels, and trying to unpick and say one is more important than the other is actually quite difficult.
Thanks, Chris. Tamia, do you want to come in?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to pick up on that 0% businesses as well. In relation to a previous research project that I was involved with, in which we actually looked at commuting patterns, and turns out 60 to 70% of traffic is actually commuting to work. So I would have thought understanding how businesses operate as employers and how they require their employees to travel to work, or encourage them to travel to work, and they can do all sorts of interventions. So we saw things like a company having an app with other companies who were on the same site that allowed workers of these particular companies who were traveling to the same site to share trips, for example, if they lived on locations where there was no public transport. They can do a lot about encouraging to use public transport as well. So, or promoting flexible hours, working from home, like as COVID demonstrated as well. So I guess from that perspective, what I wanted to perhaps bring out as well is that we need to look at this problem maybe a bit more systemically, and not necessarily from the perspective of which roads we are building and where, but look at the whole system and look at this intricate network of people and institutions essentially that are involved, and how they are related to one another, and then how these relationships create whatever we see as a mobility pattern overall. And of course, that also kind of suggests that there's no one organization that will be all powerful and can deliver this whole thing on their own. So there might be key leverage points in that system, and there might be more, there might be institutions or organizations that can potentially reinforce or facilitate change, but ultimately we need to look at the whole network of stakeholders, and perhaps also think about how to do this change and how to govern differently. So maybe the top-down approach doesn't work in some cases. And there is need for continually learning and engaging and delegate things, but there might be also cases in which we just need the government to mandate something, and that's it, and there is no further appeal or deliberation over the issue, I guess.
Thanks, Tamir. Karen, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to rehearse things that people have already said, but if I could, I want to kind of widen the question out a little bit, really, I suppose. There's something, I think, in an urban environment, increasingly now, there are question marks about the role of cities, in a post-COVID environment, not that we're quite out the other side yet, but, with the changes we've seen that COVID's made to the way that we think about work and the way that we think about society, plus the impact of climate change and where we need to be headed if we're going to tackle that. I actually think there's a massive question mark about the role of cities and work. And taking on board Tamia's point and points Chris made really about sort of why are people moving around cities and urban environments, and how do we redesign our landscapes to be more effective around that, And in order to do that properly, and in order to do that in a way that really meets people where they're at, then actually some of the most important people we need to be making sure that we involve are the people who do the moving, who are the ones that are regularly going around, and the people within that we're least likely to hear from. So Anne's point about, the people getting taxis at 4 a.m. in the morning because that's when their shift starts. We need to be talking to them about what public transport would mean to them, or we need to be talking to the kids who are having to go right to the other side of the city on a school bus, because that's what we've said our school policy is going to be. Actually, we need to talk to people about why are they moving around, and how can we make that a journey that either doesn't need to happen, or is that a more sustainable one. And I think really for me there are big questions for me really about, do we really need to look radically at redesigning our cities? Do we need things like 20-minute neighbourhoods and other forms of making sure that actually people can get their needs met, or most of their needs met, really hyper-locally? Like, why are we suggesting, for example, that an 11-year-old needs to go from one side of Birmingham to the other, in a round trip that might take them 2 hours on a bus they don't need to be on, to go to school, when actually they're passing several schools much closer to them on the way? It's like we've designed in mobility because we've been able to have it. I think we need to be just as keen to design it out, but we need to design it out with people and not do stuff to them, because otherwise the very people who we need to be doing this for the most will get left out of the design, and we'll be doing stuff to them that in a way that further exacerbates the exclusion that they're currently facing anyway. If I think about some of the people we work with, being able to get on a bus with the whole family and go to the other side of the city is something they often can't afford, both in terms of the financial implications of that and the time implications of that, even if the bus is running at times when they need to be able to get from one side of the city to the other. So there's just something for me about getting it right and meeting human need with our transport system. That's what we need to be doing, but we need to rethink what it even means to be moving people around en masse in such a way.
Absolutely. We've had a couple of points in the chat. So Jenny says there are probably big regional differences. So here in the Southwest, the local authorities have been heavily lobbied about rural public transport links. But when I lived in a village, and even here in a town, the buses that pass are only part full. A good analysis of supply and demand needs doing, as when double deckers were phased out for single. Brenda's saying, as a retired person who cannot realistically ride a bike or walk far, I need individual transport to travel to appointments and maintain social links. Would love to see smaller vehicles or shared vehicles on demand. There are a lot of people like me. And Chris, you made a point in the chat about universities being very influential and help support better public transport and active travel for cities where they are based. Do you want to say a bit more on that, or is that self-explanatory?
I think it largely is, but I think people talk about like Nottingham, Oxford, Brighton as being good places for good public transport, sort of as more of your smaller cities, if you like. Obviously the Manchesters and Londons, whatever, you generally expect it to be better, but those, I mean, Brighton and Nottingham, Oxford have always been in the top three. They're sort of interchange really, and I think Brighton's been there a lot, and it's because there's a lot of students. Brighton historically had a lot of foreign English students coming over. That's probably less likely now with COVID and with Brexit. But all of those people come over, they don't have a car. 99% of them don't. So they help support high levels of public transport for local people. Now, people still say that the cost is still quite high and too high. So it's still a barrier for people who are less well off. But we wouldn't have the services that we have without those students. And that's true for quite a number of cities around the country, and to some extent also for active travel.
Karen, did you want to?
Yeah, can I kind of add to that really, because I'm often really inspired by what's happening in other parts of the world. And there are at least a couple of countries or cities in other countries across Europe that are doing free public transport for everybody. I think if we want people to use public transport, we remove cost as a barrier. That for me is a no-brainer, and it's certainly something I know we've discussed in the past in Birmingham when we've been looking at social exclusion, even before we were looking at it through the lens of climate action. There's something for me as well about using our physical infrastructure differently. So there's a whole load of work around 8 to 80. So designing cities for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old. And the argument being, if you can do that, if you design them for an 8 to 80-year-old, you're designing it to work well for everybody's well-being. And that's part of a movement in South America where they close motorways and roads every Sunday or at least once a month, and they repurpose their physical infrastructure. And I've seen it in European cities as well, where they've repurposed dual carriageways and big motorways that were running through cities as parks. You know, I think we need to think about how we live very differently, but we need to try and sell that in a way that's really positive. And I don't mean sell it in a cynical way. I mean, we really need to engage people in how actually it could feel and be better to live differently and to live much more locally. You know, it needs to not be a deficit model. You can't fly, you can't do this, that, the other. It actually needs to be, you know, the benefits of doing it much more locally and with much more of a well-being design in mind. Well-being for individuals, well-being for communities, and well-being for the planet.
Absolutely. So I've got a couple of points in the chat, which I think actually link to the third question I want to pose. So we'll come back to those. So I want to talk now about inclusivity for change, which has been a thread that's run through. So we know that transport can be quite a polarising issue, especially with regards to some interventions that support decarbonisation efforts, either directly or indirectly. So I'm thinking here of clean air zones, low traffic neighbourhoods, and indeed can affect different people in different ways, especially in the short term. So my last question is to the audience is around how controversial transport is as an issue. So do transport interventions cause big debates in your local area? Yes, no, we've not had any changes. So is transport something that can be polarising where you live? Okay, so 62% say yes, transport interventions cause big debates in their area. 24% say no, 14% we've not had any changes. So can I come to you first, Tamir, with this last question? How can we ensure that we not only bring people with us, but make sure we have a fair movement towards a more sustainable transport system?
Yeah, I guess there is something in that question, and also a way in which I answered the previous question, that perhaps in the academic sphere, we have a tendency to think about transport system as if everything that affects or is affected by mobility can be actually condensed into a system that we can then understand and we can deal with. And of course, that is a way to learn more about transport and mobility, and to perhaps develop some insights which can be useful. But I guess also there has to be an understanding at some point that different people care about different things. And so in relation to decarbonization, it's also about trying to make the links between that agenda of decarbonization and the transport within that. And other things that might be more interesting for people to talk about, or might be more grabbing, like air quality. I think there were quite a few comments about pollution around schools due to traffic conditions, or physical fitness around active travel for many people. I certainly have been passed by many commuters in London who thought they were in the Tour de France with carbon fiber bicycles. It was a bit interesting and scary sometimes. And also for having spaces for children to play, which I think, again, is something that was mentioned in the chat as well. So I guess you could shift the question and try to find those win-wins if they exist, or if they don't exist. That is also, I guess, a really important knowledge and something to be unpacked. So I guess it's there has to be something to be said about ensuring more fundamentally that fairness is on the agenda, and it's unpacked within institutions when they are making decisions. So it's about the evidence in that sense, evidence, for example, what we can develop from the systems thinking, or thinking about transport as a system, but also about engaging with, for example, community organizations on a regular basis, to ensure that the concerns of different types of communities are heard and known and articulated, and also maintaining a continual dialogue. So one of the things that has been highlighted through this CREDS research that we are doing was that although consultations and discussions and engagement happens with communities, it's very often very sporadic. It's spread over a long time. It's perhaps more about things that have already been decided rather than actually thinking about the targets and issues more in a more deliberative way. So I think it's also about how we engage. Sorry,
Thanks,
long answer there.
Yeah, Karen, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I hold with a lot of that, and I if I can pick up the baton of how we engage, I think that's really important. I think we all get really used to hearing the loudest voices about it. And Chris made a really well-made point earlier. I mean, he's made loads. I don't mean to pick. He's just made one. But one of the points that really resonated with me right from the outset really was his point about, well, who's flying? You know, who is it that's doing all of that? And you know, we get really used to the same people speaking and being heard, and the same people often with power and influence. But actually, you know, there are loads more people who don't get asked or who don't get heard. And there's something for me about, I think we have a responsibility as organizations to really make sure that we're actively listening in the places where we don't normally. You know, people, you know, we've certainly done a whole lot of work around techniques like deep democracy and process work, so that we're very much looking to hear all the voices, and we're going to find those voices. We're not expecting them to come to us. You know, we're really trying to make sure that that when we provide a connection back to policymakers, we've done that with the broadest range of voices that we possibly can. And some of the work that we've done, we did an event for a climathon a couple of years ago, where we brought people from DFT and other places. We brought them into communities, and we hosted a whole load of events over the course of a 12-hour day, starting with the rush hour and watching the city from Alpha Tower, watching the city begin to come to life and all the traffic flooding into the city. And then we took them to a parent breakfast in one of the most deprived parts of the city, where they sat and met a group of about 80 parents who talked to them about what it is that stops them doing sustainable climate action work, particularly around transport. And I think some of our colleagues were expecting there to be things like your bus stops aren't in the right places, or it's too expensive. And actually what a lot of the parents were saying were things like, you know, if I get on the bus, I get racially abused with my kids, I'm not going to do that. Or, you know, actually when I want to walk the kids to school, there's so much rubbish and cars driving past so fast that I don't feel safe. And so, you know, actually, if we can join the bits of the system that make the decisions to the reality of the lives that most people lead, what stops them, what enables them, what's going to bring them on that journey, what's going to make it a just transition, so that we're not designing things for people like us, you know, the commuters, the people with a bit of privilege. You know, actually we're designing it for the people but most of the people who really need to use it. There's something for me then about making sure that we hear all the voices. So the way we do what we do, I don't think there's anything that radical that we're not doing. I think it's just that we're not doing it deep enough, and we're not doing it broadly enough, and we're in danger of leaving behind the people that always get left behind. And I think, you know, that to some extent I'd pin a bit of that on you know, a capitalist patriarchal system that kind of makes us behave like that anyway, but without, you know, drawing it back from a rant about that. You know, I definitely think there are things that we all need to do to make sure that we're hearing the widest range of voices we possibly can, including people in what's being done, not doing it to them.
Now we're cooking, Karen, overturning the capitalist system on a Thursday night. That's what it's all about. No, great, thank you. Chris, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I was just picking up on that last point, but maybe not quite so extreme, but I think there does need to be a complete redesign of the system in terms of who it's actually working for. I think you're picking up on the points that Karen's been making. I mean, public transport at the moment is on life support. It's struggling because fundamentally a lot of the richer commuters have found they're able to work from home and have a much better quality of life, and so many of them are. And are not commuting in the droves that they were. So rail in particular suffered from that. But the rail industry is still stuck in the 19th or 20th century, just thinking about commuting. Commuting is actually quite a small proportion of overall traffic levels. It's about 20%, I think, now. Leisure is a far bigger factor. And equally, people's everyday needs is a far bigger factor. I think it was Karen who talked about, oh no, somebody was in the chat, I think it might be Nan, talked about people having to take taxis in rural areas. You know, when I was at Campaign for Better Transport, I was dealing with a lot of issues like that with people who are losing buses. We don't get many complaints about buses now because I think most of the bus cuts have happened, unfortunately, in rural areas. There's not really much left. But it's mad that the buses stopped. They were set up around, if you were lucky to have a daily service, they were sort of semi-set up around a standard 9 to 5. Well, we have a lot of people now who don't work standard 9 to 5s. They're working shift work, so they can, you know, whether it's in pubs, in warehouses, whatever it happens to be. So you need that full spread across the day. Then you have people who are now working weekends. You have people, if they are working Monday to Friday, well, they want to be able to live at the weekend. They don't want to have to become hermits because they can't then travel because there's no bus service on the Saturday or Sunday. And, you know, one of the best things that sort of stuck in my mind was when, you know, Thought for the Day was played one day, referenced, you know, some of the discussions that Campaign for Better Transport have been having, and talked about how they'd had to move their Sunday service to a Tuesday because there were no buses on a Sunday and people couldn't travel. And there's something inherently wrong that a public service, which public transport should be, is designed around the needs of operators or the government or whoever, and not around actually what people need. And I think that would go a huge way to tackling some of these inequalities and issues if we completely rethought, you know, how we provide public transport and what it's needed for. Because at the moment, I think people are still stuck in that old way of thinking. I think just to go on a little bit, the thing about how do we bring people with us, and I think it's right. We've got to sell the positive, and I think, you know, it's a bit like reclaiming the streets, that, you know, to become more beautiful, more attractive, more pleasant places to exist in. At the moment, a lot of streets, you just want to get through them as quickly as possible because they're so unpleasant. But where you start to see some of these changes happening in places, people start to really wake up and notice them and start to linger, and that can be good for local businesses as well, and particularly cafes and other types of things. So I think we can do it by showing how positive change makes a real difference. And the more we can do in this country, the more real it comes for people over here, because a lot of people dismiss anything that is across the channel, or you know, wherever. They won't accept it. It can't possibly happen here. We're very, very different for some reason. And the other thing really was that there's a tension, as I see it. We're in a climate emergency that requires urgent action, but how do you balance that with engaging and people bringing people with you? There's something inherently ill at ease, if you like, in that sense. And just to finish off, just in terms of I think people's acceptance of the status quo and understanding of what change might be. I think people saw a glimpse of what life could be like during the first lockdown. Now, I know it was unreal because people weren't traveling, but they got a sense how much more pleasant local places could be. And I think it's a bit like carbon monoxide poisoning. I think we've been sat there and slowly overcome by traffic and not really noticed how it's degraded our environment. And somehow we've got to switch off that tap and sort of open people's eyes to the possibility that actually you can, even when we're sort of living active lives, live in a much better and nicer place. And if we can do that, we will be halfway towards getting there.
Thanks, Chris, and that links really nicely to James's reflection in the chat, which was that we're happier to see transport become more difficult and slow by virtue of more cars, which is a slow and steady deterioration with no one cause, rather than by a single action such as an LTN. So it's kind of like that sort of distinction, isn't it, between incremental, slow change that actually might be very detrimental to us and not what we want, and the kind of short, sharp shock that might actually be something we want into that longer term, but it's sort of harder for us to sort of negotiate that change, if you like, and feel uneasy about it. And there's loads of great points coming into the chat, which I'm no doubt missing. Let me have a look. So Patrick's made a point about linking to what Karen was saying about how we work sort of together on consultation, and saying there's precious little co-creation on interventions at the moment, and that's maybe something we need to think about a lot more, which also links back to James's point. Brenda saying she likes the idea of making facilities more local. I have a question from Brenda actually, which is, what would you like future transport to be? You know, what would you like our future transport to look like? Does anyone want to, what should we be aiming for? You know, regardless of the decarbonisation challenge, I guess. Karen, go for it.
I mean, I've got a single word answer, really: free. And I do appreciate the point, I think it was made in the chat, that, you know, free doesn't mean it's not funded. I'm more than happy for some of my taxpayers' funding to go on that, but I think it should be free. I think we should be able to get on it, you know, irrespective of whether we can afford it, and it should be running all of the time where we need to go. So, you know, I would want to see it free, open, accessible, regular, clean, all those kinds of things. But you know, ultimately, I think if we all grew up using it all of the time, that would be the start to us really being able to then take some control over making it really fit the needs that we've got.
Great. Anyone else want to come in on that one? Had a query in the chat. I'm using jargon, my apologies. LTN is low traffic neighbourhood. So where we've tried to sort of pedestrianise things, primarily in the wake of COVID, to allow people more space, that's become, you know, really positive step for some people, but also a little bit controversial for others who see it as sort of traffic being dispersed unfairly into other areas and just moving problems around. And we might want to reflect on that. Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think just doing what we've already got better, making better use of what we've got. I mean, we've got trains, we've got buses, we've got trams, we've got bikes, we've got feet. You know, we just need to make it easier and safer and better and more attractive to use them. There's a lot of emphasis on new technology will suddenly get us out of all of these problems, and it won't. You know, we saw how technology sorted the air pollution problem. You know, and it's the same thing with electric vehicles, apart from the fact they're very, very expensive. You know, if we have the same number of electric vehicles as we have currently petrol and diesel vehicles, we're just going to still be stuck in huge traffic jams and huge inequalities, and them taking over vast amounts of space in our you know, cities and urban areas. So you know, I think we do need to grab some of the new technology. So we do need to electrify, or hydrogen where it's too difficult. And information is I think one of the biggest areas that we really need to grab hold of, because that does make the integration and the hiring and sharing economy much more accessible to people. You know, younger people are, you know, on their apps, they're, you know, quite happy to hire a bike when they go visit somewhere, or a scooter, or whatever it happens to be. You can integrate that with, you know, public transport information, and you're breaking down the barriers to actually accessing it. Bring in freeness. I would qualify the freeness. I would say free public transport should be on the local level. I think some of the longer distance stuff, I think there should be some charge, but I think it should be a lot lower than we currently pay. And I think if we can integrate, you know, make the best of the sort of the information technology linked in with charging, with existing technologies we already have, just start doing them properly or better, then I think we've got the solutions. It's actually having the political will to deliver them. And that's the big barrier. And people always, who don't want change, keep sort of trying to distract you with new technology. And I think that's not really the answer.
Does anyone have any questions that might not necessarily cover anything we've discussed so far, but anyone in the audience want to just throw out a question that they're interested in to our panel? Do fire them in the chat or the Q&A. Patrick's suggesting he'd like a transport system that's less monolithic, more flexible and safe, and that Birmingham City Council is taking space from cars, and that's a start at least. and suggesting maybe free means freedom to move 24/7. Any other questions, comments? Have one here. How do we get car-free days? How can we get that to happen? Anyone want to have a strategy? Karen?
Well, we on a very small scale, we do that with the Active Streets programme. I definitely think there's more we could do to mobilise together. I think we need to find our flock, and we need to get, we need to coalesce around people that are like-minded and organise this kind of thing. Ideally, you'd have that coming top down. And I think, but I know how difficult it is. When I used to work for the city council, just trying to close a road to put on, a cycling event or a running event, it involves months of planning, and loads of people, particularly businesses, would kick off about not being able to get their citizens into the city, or customers into the city. So I think there's still some changes will have to be made top down, but there's absolutely nothing to stop us from organising car-free days, like bottom up actually. And it comes back to the very first question for me: what can ordinary people do? Find other ordinary people with similar views and come together to challenge the people that have the power. Ultimately, for me, that's what we can do.
Chris, Tamir, do you want to come in, or should we?
I think that's right. I think you can sort of do it on a street by street basis, where it's probably easy to organise and achieve. But I also think there's potentially opportunity post-COVID, where a lot of businesses actually appreciated being able to take over space within, take over road space to expand out into the street. So I think there's potentially more of an appetite amongst, I'm not saying every business, but amongst certain businesses in certain areas for that to happen. And I think it's a question of maybe picking your areas or picking your fights, if you like, to, going for the easy wins and showing how those can be successful. And then hopefully from there, you can then spread it, and don't try and necessarily do it a big bang and try and get everything in the city car free in one go. I think it's a question of maybe showing, people how it can work and how much more attractive it can be.
Patrick's saying we need to support the politicians who are trying. Local politicians have had a lot of hate mail because of low traffic neighbourhood interventions, for example. And I think that goes back to the point that was made earlier about, if we're happy with something, we won't write a letter and say we're happy about it. We only do that when we're annoyed. And so it creates a really skewed picture, doesn't it? So I think where we can encourage and make our feelings of, we're happy with the change felt, then I think we should do that. And just finally, a reflection from Soph. I don't think we've got a chance really to answer it, but how do we encourage councils to ensure availability of safe, affordable and reliable transportation for students? As Chris mentioned earlier, universities have a lot of influence. Does anyone have any quick thought on what our strategies might be for that? Creating affordable transport.
But if I'm going to talk about from Brighton, the bus company does have cheaper fares for students. For example, it's got a huge number of buses that go out to the universities, so they're often very populated. There's always people around, so I think there's a safety in numbers, if you like, from that area. And I think if you can encourage good active travel measures also being put in, so people have got that independence, and it's a cheaper way of traveling, which is safe and secure, so people traveling at night don't feel vulnerable or isolated, then that's the way that you can go about it, I think.
I can just add our free bikes initiative that we've got in Birmingham, where the 7,500 bikes have gone out. The evaluation on the use of those shows that they pay for themselves within 2 years. So in terms of health benefits and other benefits, and that includes the carbon reduction. So there's something for me, and that's now running across Birmingham. It's also running across Essex and Southall. There are ways that you can do it in a really cost-effective way, but there has to be the joining between bottom-up initiatives and top-down, because there are people with power that just still get in the way because they don't want things to change. And that's the crux of it for me, challenging those people.
Do you have any last final words?
Well, I'm not sure to what extent this is new or anything, but maybe going back to the who we engage and how, I guess also councils have an opportunity to do engagement and consultation and co-creation processes and whatnot with children who do have to get to school. And I'm wondering to what extent that is something that is being done. So definitely in Cambridge, it was something that was talked about as a new thing when in an initiative we came up with the answer that actually, although the question is all about transport, what we are interested about is how students who live in villages around get to school, because they don't have the opportunity to drive a car. So what do they do?
There's some really interesting and important comments coming in on the chat, which hopefully people have been able to see. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much to everyone who's attended tonight. Just to say that if you are interested in the debates and discussion that we've had today, there is the Forum for Global Challenges that we're hosting at the University of Birmingham in May. If you'd like to come to that, the call for contributions is the 3rd of December. The deadline 3rd of December, and that will be hosted in May. It's open to all who want to come along, so do give that a look. Just to say thank you again to everyone for attending. Thanks to Karen, Chris, Tamaya, for a really sort of enriching, I think, and inspiring conversation about actually we do have power to affect change. We can do things from the bottom up. We can put pressure on our national and local officials to sort of take this seriously. And there was a shout out to those people who live in Birmingham to join with the COP26 Birmingham campaign led by Ollie Armstrong. And I'm sure those of you who live elsewhere, there will be similar COP26 action groups around. So do check those out. So just thank you, everyone. And please keep in touch with us. You can find us on Twitter in various guises, and we're always interested in keeping the conversation going. So thank you all. Have a lovely evening. Take care.